Nick, if I can ask, should we start now?
We are now live, James, so just maybe give it 15 seconds more for people to join us. I think we're good to go.
Okay. Welcome to this online workshop on how European election results shape EU border policies. My name is James Cantor. I'm the editor of the EU Scream Politics podcast and a former correspondent at the New York Times. I'm co-moderating this event today with the journalist and author Leila Mignano, who works with Investigate Europe. And our partners for this event are the Transnational Institute, TNI, and the Global Strategic Communications Council, GSCC. The idea for this workshop emerged from a number of European organizations working on border policy. And a big part of the idea is about how to respond to misinformation by anti-migrant politicians and how they can be better scrutinized by the media. And, for example, to look more at the role of the border industry, which is something that may not be getting enough attention. I also should say that this workshop today is a pilot for possible future sessions on topics around migration. For example, push and pull factors, smuggling, and public opinion on migration. So we'll be seeking feedback at the end on what you found useful and what can be improved. Leila will shortly introduce our great panel. They'll address a number of themes around politics, economics, and the human dimensions of EU border policies. But first, some very quick housekeeping. This will be recorded so you can catch up later. Leila and I will give each of our panelists a maximum of 10 minutes to talk about their work and their thinking, and we'll give panelists a nudge to wrap up at around 8 minutes. We'll then aim to take at least one question from you, the audience, after each panelist makes their presentation. So do please start sending questions while you're listening. For your questions, please use the Q&A tab in Zoom. That's the Q&A tab rather than the chat. Once we've heard from our speakers, we'll aim to come back to more of your questions, and that Q&A will round out this workshop, which should last for around an hour. I hope that's clear, and I'll pass it over to you, Leila, to make the introductions.
Thank you. So I'm Leila Minano. I'm a French reporter. I work for Investigate Europe. Well, I've been lately working in different investigative story regarding migration and exile at the EU borders or on the Migration Pact. So I will be co-moderating these panels with my colleagues. Maybe first a short introduction of our speakers. So we have here Dr. Elizabeth Mavropoulou, who is a lecturer in international law at the University of Westminster and specializes in international refugee law and human rights law. Our research focuses on international cooperation and responsibility sharing on refugee, externalization of asylum and international protection, and the protection of human rights at sea. Elizabeth has also worked in the NGO sector at the UK-based charity Human Rights at Sea, leading in research, policy, and advocacy work. And then there we have Sally Hayden, which is an award-winning journalist and a photographer currently focused on migration, conflict, and humanitarian crisis. Her first book, My Fourth Time Withdrawn, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route, was published in 2022 and won many Best Book Awards, including the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. She's an adjunct professor at the UCD Sutherland School of Law. And then you have Mark Akkerman, who is a researcher at Stop Wapenhandel, and the author of more than 10 reports on the European border industry and the border policy that have been published together with the Transnational Institutes. Maybe, James, you want to say a word?
Yeah, thank you very much for those introductions, Leila. We're going to turn first to Elizabeth. for your thoughts on the politics around the new EU Migration Pact, what that's going to mean for EU policy, neighboring countries, what's going to come, and what more can journalists sort of explore about what's going on in this sphere. Please, Elizabeth.
Thank you, James. I hope you'll hear me very well, and welcome to everyone. I will try to do justice to the question in such a short time, given that the pact itself raises all series of issues. So the Migration Pact is what the name suggests. It's the latest framework on asylum, migration, and border management policies. It is now EU law, so most of the regulations and directives will be applicable from July 2026, with a couple of ones being applicable since June 2024. Now, the pact's objective is to establish seamless migration processes and stronger governances. It is not to protect asylum seekers, refugees, or migrants' rights at EU states borders. A closer look at its key legislative instruments and policy shows that the pact is in fact geared to externalizing border controls and international protection obligations. Now, this is visible in the EU's external dimension of migration management and its cooperation with third countries. So what the EU has done is that they have embedded migration management with partnerships with countries in the region by making access to funding for non-EU countries or access to EU membership or visa liberalizations conditional upon cooperation on migration management objectives. So the EU says, we'll give you the money insofar as you enhance your border control, contain migration flows, and conclude readmission agreements. So migration management is now streamlined within the EU external relations, affecting areas such as trade and development. The EU already operates partnership with third countries on migration management. One of the oldest is the EU-Turkey Statement of 2016, also based on a quid pro quo between the EU and Turkey, the visa liberalizations for Turkey nationals in exchange for Turkey's admitting irregular migrants from Greece back to Turkey, also with a questionable record of human rights violations under that statement as well. We've got the EU-Libya cooperation. That form of partnership is facilitated through Italy. So Italy has an MOU with Libya since 2008. And most recently renew after the Arab Spring the cooperation with Libya, and under that it is very well known and well documented that the EU funds and equips the Libyan Coast Guard, which is effectively run by Libyan militia and has been complicit in violations again at EU state borders, including pullbacks and pushbacks. We've got also, since 2023, a proliferation of new partnership of the EU or Team Europe, so member states and EU with third countries. There's one with EU and Morocco, renewed in 2014, of 152 million. There is the very questionable deal with Tunisia, 1.7 billion in EU infrastructure. So EU will support and train and equip Tunisian border guards. As a result, Tunisia have to conclude a readmission agreement of irregular migrants. There is an agreement with Egypt, 7.4 billion agreement. And there is an agreement with Mauritania, Mauritania Migration Partnership, 210 million in border management. Now, this particular partnership with Mauritania focuses a lot of containment, so prevent of irregular migration, because Mauritania now has been the exit country into EU and Spain. And finally, there is a recent deal with Lebanon, about 1 billion in border migration management assistance to Lebanon, given that Lebanon is a large refugee host country. Now, a very short note on where this money comes from, although we'll hear more later from my fellow speakers. All this money comes from the EU budget. The long-term EU budget is known as the multi-annual framework. It currently runs now from 2021 to 2027, and money from those budgets is allocated also to migration policy pots. There is a specific pot on asylum, migration and integration funds, which runs again for the 2021-2027, that has been allocated about 9.8 billion. Now, part of this money is not only going to go to member states for intra-EU solidarity and responsibility sharing and protection, but it's also going to be allocated to cooperation with third countries as of these agreements discussed above. Now, all these agreements fall under the wider trend of externalization. This is something we hear very often from policymakers, commentators, academics. It's the idea of externalization of border control or asylum. Now, as a term, it is contested, and you can find various definitions on that, but it can be simply understood as the shifting of state functions. So state functions that normally are conducted within a state's territory are now being outsourced outside its state's territory. So think of defense. Defense is one of the most common state functions outsourced to another state or even non-state actor. Equally, border control, asylum processing can also be outsourced. It's a very old idea. It's not a new one, although the term is currently in vogue. But since the 1990s, externalization measures have appeared in concepts such as protection elsewhere, deterrence, non-entrée, and some measures of externalization that we often don't hear anymore about is carrier sanctions, right? Externalizing border control to private actors, visa regimes, maritime interceptions, all these externalization measures as well. Of course, the idea of a regional processing, which is something currently very much within Brussels' idea of the future of asylum policy, and it's a project that the deal between Italy and Albania is currently considering and fleshing out, is the idea of processing asylum claims outside the EU. And those who are found to have a genuine claim for international protection, they can only then enter EU territory. I think that this has been very much also a responsibility of a policy spill or trend coming over from down under. Australia has been pioneering for the past 15 years offshore processing regimes with notoriously questionable human rights records. Another question that we should also be asking is whether these externalization agreements are legal, because they might be quite complex to navigate the legal landscape. And in short, is that in principle, yes, they can be. There is no rule in international law that explicitly prohibits the shifting of state function to another state or a non-state actor. However, there is a requirement that such agreements comply with international legal obligations of states. So in this field of migration and asylum and border control, arrangement between states should comply with refugee and human rights law standards. In practice, we've seen that those agreements rarely comply with such standards and raise serious issues of compliance with international human rights and refugee law. Particularly under the context of the EU, Turkey, and Italy, Libya, there have been systematic violations at the EU's external borders of the rights of migrants and refugees. Basically, the right to asylum has been outright denied. There have been systematic interceptions and pushbacks or pullbacks at both the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean and Central Mediterranean routes. Again, pushbacks amount to collective expulsions at the border and hence are prohibited under international law. We've seen indefinite and prolonged detention, family separation, torture, death, kidnapping, all as a result of those externalization agreements, those practices of international cooperation. But there are also
just a gentle reminder.
Yes, yes. I'm on my final notes. Thanks, James. So the last issue, which is important, particularly for journalists and reporters, is that these deals are designed to minimize accountability. They're problematic because they're often informal. They have dubious legal statuses. There are MOUs, there are protocols, there are statements, there are declarations, and they're designed to avoid constitutional review, often if it is concluded by member states, or public scrutiny more generally. Most of the times, they're not even made public, the heads of the agreements. So we don't know what is provided under this agreement because allegedly states argue they touch upon security and defense matters of the state. So for me, this is where reporting should really be pushing for and should be going. It's about greater accountability by requesting that such agreements are made public, but they're also that they're subject to review. And to conclude about the future direction of asylum policy in Europe, there might be the case that we might see harsher policies, harsher and more restrictive policies that might put even an end to the territorial asylum as we know it. There are discussions in Brussels to make offshore processing the default option. There is far-right rhetoric creeping from national politics to EU politics. Although with the elections, we didn't have that much far-right gains. There were some, but not as the ones expected. Still, those rhetoric is creeping up in ideas of asylum processing and offshoring of asylum. And we'll see with the new commissioner and then the new elected commission whether those proposals might be taken forward or not. Thank you very much, and I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I found that really fascinating. And of course, I'll ask a question if I may, because I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and put one to you. Just really to follow up, those are huge sums of money for the partnerships. And I wonder, to what extent does the EU make those sums of money clear? And to what extent do they make clear what that money is really going towards in terms of border measures? Does accountability journalism have to be done at that end of things as well?
I'll start from the last. Yes, I think that it should be done, because a lot of these deals, as I said, they're not necessarily public. There's not a set of public expenditure that says they do somehow allocate the money. So they conclude a partnership which is of 10 billion, and they say the 7 billion will go to migration and strengthening of border management. However, there is not any breakdown of cost in anything that is written. So part of the reporting and part of the journalism to enhance accountability is that public expenditure, because at the end of the day, this money comes from EU and comes from also the member states. Another argument that has been raised on that is also a lot of money goes in the region and to third countries, and it doesn't go in the frontline member states that actually receive high numbers of asylum applications. So in a way, extra EU solidarity is somehow prioritized rather than intra-EU solidarity when it comes to money, sharing money.
Super. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Layla, who I think will bring Mark into the webinar. Over to you, Layla.
All right. Yes, just for information, the Q&R is the button that you have to go just there, Q&R. So we just have to enter your question here, and if it doesn't work, maybe you can add them on the chat. So maybe we'll go to our second panelist. So Mark is going to tell us about, to help us to understand very technical question, often for journalists, which is the budget. So where is the money for the EU border policy held? How is it decided? Who profits from here? And of course, how can journalists better follow the money? This huge amount of money we have just been hearing about. Maybe Mark? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
You are muted. You have to open your micro just there.
Yeah, I muted myself again, sorry. So I will try to give an overview of the most important EU budgets and instruments in the field of border security and control, and I identify the key industrial players and their lobby. Yes, thank you. So Frontex has seen an explosive increase in its budgets, starting in 2005 as a small agency with the task of coordinating and streamlining member states' border security efforts. It had a budget of 5.5 million euros. Under the MFF, Multi-Annual Financial Framework 2007-2014, its annual budget grew to about 90 to 100 million euros a year. But then with the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, a steep increase started, first mostly on an ad hoc basis, as stopping migration remained high on the EU's political agenda. And under the current MFF, Frontex has been given another spending boost, with this year's budget of 922 million euros and increasing to 1.27 billion in 2027. So that means that the budget then will be 66 times as high as in its first full operational year, 2006. This budget increase accompanies an expanding mandate and organization. Frontex is building its own armed standing border guard corps and is buying its own equipment for border control and patrol, where it used to be completely dependent on contributions of personnel and equipment by member states. Then you also have the EU-LISA, the EU Agency for the Operational Management of Large-Scale IT Systems in the area of freedom, security and justice, which operates the systems for border and migration management, in particular several increasingly connected biometrics databases such as Eurodac. And much of its budget, which is roughly between 200 and 300 million a year, is spent on large, long-running contracts with IT companies. Most of the other EU instruments for border security and control objectives provide funds to member states to strengthen their efforts in these areas, sometimes combined with funding for actions on union level. The main fund for this is the Border Management and Visa Instrument of the Integrated Border Management Fund. Its budget of 7.13 billion, which has seen several increases in the course of the current MFF, is significantly higher than of its predecessors. The External Borders Fund, and which had a budget of 1.7 billion, and the Internal Security Fund, Borders and Visa, which had a budget of 2.76 billion euros. Money from these funds can be used for a wide variety of actions, including the purchase of equipment, setting up large-scale IT systems, construction of infrastructure, training and studies. It is often hard to determine where this money is actually going. According to a recent study by organizations Akkerman and Akkerman, so far, over 70% of the allocations under the Border Management of Visa Instrument have gone to equipment, technology, and infrastructure, and only 0.04% went to initiatives designed to increase support and assistance to people with vulnerabilities and people wishing to apply for international protection. The Asylum, Migration, and Integration Fund, which Elizabeth also mentioned, has a broader scope, as its name suggests, but it does include some funding for detention and deportation activities and support. And in the midterm review process, the European Commission, supported by the Council, proposed to increase the budget under the heading Migration with 2 billion euros. And I think you can assume that a lot of this will be going towards the implementation of the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. Spending for EU border externalization efforts, which Elizabeth also already mentioned, is notoriously spread amongst many different instruments, making it hard to get a total overview. The majority of the regular funding now comes from the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe. So this is the International Development Fund, and it has a spending target of 10% of its total budget of almost 80 billion to go to migration management. And again, under the midterm review, this would be increased with about 10% the total budget. And it can also come from some other instruments, like the instrument contributing to stability and peace, the instrument for pre-accession accession assistance, programs aimed at specific regions, special trust funds and facilities, the Frontex budget, and other instruments. A significant part of all this is used for funding border security and control equipment purchases from third countries or on direct equipment donations. All of these budgets and their rapid increases have contributed to creating a lucrative border security and control market. For the coming years, market analysis companies estimate growth rates of between 5 and 7% per year on a global scale, with steeper increases for Europe. There are thousands of larger and smaller companies that play a part in the border industrial complex. Main players in the European market are foremost large EU arms companies, Airbus, Leonardo and Thales, which all have broad general military and security portfolios. And then there are many more specialized companies, for example, shipbuilders like Fincantieri from Italy and Damen from the Netherlands. They've supplied many border guards with patrol vessels. Hensoldt, which is the result of the sales of the electronics defense division of Airbus, focuses on radar and sensor technology for surveillance. And the Spanish European security fencing, as an example, is one of the few producers of those concertinas of barbed wire, which are placed on many border walls and fences. And for among the most important beneficiaries of the large contracts for biometric databases are IDEMIA and Soprasteria. One of the key features of the EU border industry is that it is highly effective in influencing policy. Companies put a lot of effort into this. They have plenty of meetings with the European Commission and with MEPs, for example. Now, not all of the meetings that you see on the screen are about border or broader security and military issues, but they all contribute to the increasingly close relationship between authorities and industry. Then there are many more meetings at arms and security fairs, roundtables, conferences, and the industry also publishes influential policy proposals and does effective media campaigns. In many cases, the lobby from the industry side is embraced by authorities who tend to see company representatives as experts on border and migration issues, rather than lobbyists that are foremost striving for the company's interests and profits. And as a result, several of the key steps in the development of the EU's border and migration policies, such as the expansion of the mandate of Frontex, have fundamental elements that can be traced back to earlier industry proposals. Of course, now in general, there's a lot of support for the European arms industry as part of the rapid militarization of Europe and the sharp increases in military spending. Through various EU instruments, the EU channels billions of euros to the industry under this MFF. And meanwhile, arms export regulations are weakened or pushed aside to help achieve the actual main goal of these instruments, strengthening the international competitiveness of the EU arms industry, or in other words, more arms exports to countries outside the EU. This will likely have consequences in the area of migration as well. There's a high risk that more EU arms exports under more permissive export rules will contribute to war, armed conflict, repression, and human rights violations around the world, and thereby increase reasons to force people to flee. In the same sense, it will allow for easier exports to authoritarian regimes in the context of migration deals with the EU or one or more member states. And then to conclude a quick look ahead, there is a proposal to increase budget for the remainders of this MFF. And I think the proposal for the next MFF will again include larger budgets for border security and control, as the EU is firmly stuck in a one-sided discourse regarding migration. The further shift to the right will undoubtedly result in more anti-immigration sentiments and stricter policies. Though I think it remains to be seen if this will play out mostly on the EU level, or with the far right's often equally dominant anti-EU stances will take place more on national levels of member states. In any case, where there might be differences in arguments about the implementation of migration and border policies, in particular about responsibilities of member states, there's much agreement on cooperation with non-EU countries. So I think the trend towards externalization will prevail, and deals with non-EU countries will remain high on the agenda. And on the other hand, the increasingly close ties between authorities and the military and security industry and the growth in financial support to arms companies, mostly due to the increases in military spending, will continue to foster the influence of this industry on EU and national policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have now three questions on the Q&A. Two for Elizabeth, one for Mark for the moment. I remember you that you have this little button where you can ask the question while the speaker are talking. So the first question is from David Seber. So to Elizabeth, what EU states are mostly pushing for offshoring asylum application to third countries? Are we going to see UK Rwanda-like deals being proposed soon by EU states?
Shall I address now the question for me?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So we might not get to see a deal like UK Rwanda, which, by the way, is off the table now with the new Labour government in this country, because the UK Rwanda was a very extreme model of offshore. processing, because the objective there wasn't just offshore processing of asylum claims, right? It was about never ever entering UK territory and receiving protection in another country, which is safe. In that case was Rwanda. So the UK-Rwanda deal raised serious issues of the equivalence of human rights standards between the UK and Rwanda, the forcible transfer of those individuals who've never transit through Rwanda, never been to Rwanda, never actually been through maybe that continent as well. And also there was issues with respect to treaty and a bilateral treaty in the case of the UK-Rwanda deal, trying to satisfy Supreme Court's concern, but it was an extreme model of externalization that is unlikely to be replicated, particularly in the EU, given how strong the EU law that would not necessarily make the case for the legality of such agreement. Even in the case of the UK, the European Court of Human Rights intervened and issued interim measures. So we really don't know whether the flights would ever take off given a possible intervention by the European Court of Human Rights. At the same time, we might be seeing deals like the Italy-Albanian one. If that works, or if the European Court of Human Rights or the Court of Justice of the EU doesn't intervene successfully on that, and if it becomes a model where somehow offshore processing works in another country in the region, Albania in that case, which is not very far in the region, but is a neighbor of Italy, a neighbor of Greece, then potentially, yes, we'll be seeing this model offshore processing in Europe. But there's still significant legal obstacles for such a deal to move on.
Another question for you, maybe shortly.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've noticed externalization policy overlapping with the EU state efforts to criminalize migrants, for instance, for piloting boats, given the potential of increased surveillance cooperation with third country police forces.
Yes, of course. This tendency of criminalization is evident since 2009. It started with criminalization of NGOs, search and rescue NGOs for saving lives at sea. The captains have been arrested and charged with criminal charges of facilitating illegal migration. The same has happened in Greece. So the whole idea of crimmigration has started from the humanitarian NGOs and now has moved into migrants itself. So I think this is definitely the case, at least coming from the EU member states policy, because this is the immigration laws that are being violated at national level. The EU at the moment just, I suppose, sees the whole idea, but there has been also issues of Frontex inclusion in those kind of incidents as well.
Thank you. So the other comment was moved. Maybe we can start with the third panelist. So James, maybe you want to introduce?
Thank you, Leila. Our third panelist is Sally Hayden. Sally, you've done award-winning and highly impactful writing and reporting on the human dimension of EU borders. And with that in mind, I just wanted to sort of throw out there maybe the idea of how reporters should be thinking about and covering EU policies in this area, and sort of how you see the future for people on the move across routes like the central Mediterranean. Thanks very much, Sally.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thanks to everyone who tuned in today. Yeah, migration has become, as we all know, this political football in Europe, and it obviously raises issues of racism and xenophobia, which I think are also pretty ingrained into how a lot of the media covers it as well. At the same time, I think it can seem like the facts, context, and actual experiences and voices of people who are migrating are being stripped from the narrative. And European officials definitely aren't being challenged properly on the fact that they have basically abandoned principles of human rights to keep people away from our territory. I really think we need all hands on deck to report this and to shift the narrative away from the kind of nasty political rhetoric leading to gross human rights abuses and towards facts. And yeah, the title of the workshop and your question there was about future projections, but EU migration policy is already very brutal and opaque, and I can imagine that this is only going to get worse. I was asked to say a bit about my experience. So the big piece of work I did recently, which you mentioned there, James, was my book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, which I hope people will consider reading. It's based on years of communication with people who were locked inside Libyan migrant detention centers using hidden phones to send me information about what they were going through. And the reason I spent so many years on it was because I realized the reason people were locked up in the first place was a direct result of EU policy. So since 2017, the EU has been supporting the interceptions of people at sea by supporting both the Libyan Coast Guard and carrying out surveillance to spot the boats in the first place. Since this policy began, nearly 140,000 men, women, and children have been caught at sea and forced back to Libya. And I was also compelled to report this for so long because I found out from Frontex that despite this being EU policy, they were not documenting what happened to people past the point of interception. So what I exposed was that torture, rape, starvation, forced labor, and a host of other abuses were happening in the detention centers. In one, someone died every 2 weeks of starvation and medical neglect. There was mismanagement or negligence by EU-funded international organizations supposed to be helping, who also, their staff said they were being used to whitewash the EU policy. And there seemed to be a deliberate effort to silence the voices of people affected. For years before I published the book, I was posting screenshots of the messages I received on Twitter and publishing or broadcasting reports in a wide range of international outlets. And that type of steady reporting helped me increase sources among aid workers, diplomats, European officials, Libyan officials, and many other people. So I had many different ways to check information. And that reporting, as quite a lot of my migration reporting has been used in legal challenges, including against the UK Home Office regarding the Rwanda deportations, and in a submission to the ICC calling for named European officials to be investigated for crimes against humanity. But honestly, I'm surprised and frustrated at how there's still been no real accountability. And it's made me realize why it's so necessary to have more journalists doing good reporting on the broader topic, because the more reports there are, the harder it is to overlook or for anyone to deny. So I can see that there are a lot of excellent journalists listening in right now who do reporting from all over the place, but I was told that there'd also be journalists tuning in from inside the so-called Brussels bubble, and this part is probably more relevant to them. In my opinion, if you're reporting on the European, so-called debates around migration from comfortable rooms in Brussels, then you also might be part of the problem. You really need to encourage your outlets to let you out, or if that's not possible, maybe work with freelancers who are doing intensive work on particular areas and have spent time building up knowledge and contacts. Also think about collaborating with or hiring journalists in exile. There's good programs like the Refugee Journalism Program in the UK that have networks of journalists who have fled many of the countries people are making these journeys from. I think the best thing you can possibly do is go to places where there are lots of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, people on the move, and just talk to them. I've done this in Sudan, Tunisia, and Calais, for example. You could go to Turkey or Greece or many other parts of Europe. You could go to origin countries and ask around for the families of people who have migrated. You could go on one of the NGO rescue boats in the Mediterranean and tell your editors that these contacts probably will aid your reporting in the long term, not just on that trip. And yeah, ask the people you meet about their stories, but also what they feel is not understood or is not being reported in the media about the broader situation. And you'd, again, really be surprised with the tips and leads you get. You don't have to follow up on everything, but yeah, you'd be surprised what comes to you. You could do it like I've done a lot of times, ask for interviews, but also hand out business cards or your contact details. Even if people don't want to talk to you in the moment, they might reach out later after they've had a chance to think about it or to research you. It's good if you have Facebook and other social media, because people on the move often lose their phones and switch SIM cards, but they'll maintain access to their Facebook accounts, and make yourself easily contactable online. There's a lot of social media groups as well for different nationalities or for people making certain journeys. If you can find them and join them, you can stay in tune with the conversations that are happening. This should seem obvious, but be very careful about consent. Maybe you just need to use first names. Maybe you strip all identifying details, as I had to do with many of my Libya detention center reporting. Try also to be trauma aware. A lot of the people you meet will be very traumatized and also very mistrusting of authority figures. Think about publishing op-eds, which is what I'm trying to do a bit more, written by people you meet. Generally, I think we need more voices from people on the move talking not just about their journeys, but how they see the broader situations. And we definitely need to broaden the conversation so this isn't mostly white Europeans talking to each other, which definitely enables racism and dehumanization. In terms of stories that should be covered, like there are so many and everyone will lead you to a new one. And I can't tell everyone exactly what to cover because I want more people to be doing reporting that also challenges me. But the big one, obviously, as we've talked about, is externalization deals and their impacts. The EU is spending billions of euros to stop migration in ways that can seem somewhat effective short term, maybe, but are actually encouraging repression and increasing the reasons why people need to flee. They're sending out the message internationally that the EU cares more about stopping migration than human rights. There are loads of countries with these deals and loads of consequences. Pick a country, start to research it, find out has there been increased repression against foreigners? Are there more deportations? Are there other human rights abuses or growing authoritarianism that's being overlooked? Are militias or paramilitary groups being emboldened, as happened in Sudan ahead of the latest war? Could that lead to conflict or violence? What do civil society say? Another very big theme is corruption and exploitation as well. So refugees and asylum seekers are basically being exploited at every turn, and they witness corruption all along their journeys. Corruption is a big motivator as to why people flee in the first place. For example, I did several big investigations into corruption in the UN refugee resettlement scheme in Sudan and elsewhere, using tip-offs that I got by asking refugees there, what do you think I should be reporting? It's worth examining aid agencies. Don't just report through an INGO lens. When meeting refugees or asylum seekers, try and speak to them in neutral locations, away from NGO staff and UN agencies, as often the problems they tell you about will involve the people who are supposed to be helping them. And understanding flaws in the current systems is really essential to explaining why the broader situation is the way it is. And never take anything that any powerful body or person says as fact. My book, for example, has a lot of examples of times that UNHCR statements have been false or misleading. Be aware that big organizations can have an interest in safeguarding and increasing funding, and often that funding comes from the EU, by the way. Try and cultivate sources inside as many organizations as possible who will probably want to stay anonymous for fear of losing their jobs. Other story ideas can come from looking at some of the vague claims politicians are making, but actually following them through and getting case studies. Very often the politicians haven't done this themselves. And I can send in the links an example of a big investigation I did when politicians started suggesting that Syria might be safe to return people to, which was later used in a legal challenge against the German government. If you're reporting on political rhetoric around migration, I think you have a duty to learn as much as possible about what people are fleeing from. Sudan, for example, is currently the world's largest displacement crisis because of the war, and more than 2 million people have fled the country. Yet, how often is Sudan being mentioned in discussions around migration? And generally, I think journalists in Brussels can always help in trying to hold politicians accountable for human rights abuses. They really need to keep an eye on what others outside of Brussels are publishing and make that part of the conversation there, because for us, when we're very remote, it can be hard to, get those questions answered or actually make European officials answer them. I had a little bit more that's on framing, but I don't think that there's time. So I can always say it in response to a question or...
Yes, sorry, we have already a few questions, so maybe we can go on this way. There is a... Thank you very much. There is a question from Ajar Meda. She's asking you, what was the Journalists in Exile network in the UK?
The Refugee Journalism Program or Project.
Okay, perfect. And then there is a second question. I think it could be for both Mark and Elizabeth. I wanted to ask about financing migration management. Are there calculations on how much money is put towards preventing migration vs dealing with asylum backlog? Example, Rwanda payment for scheme now scrapped vs clearing asylum backlog. Essentially, the cost of criminalization, externalization, vs respecting international law integration. Maybe more for Mark then.
Yes, as far as I know, there aren't any calculations like that made. It's already extremely hard to determine the actual spending on. Well, I know less about the asylum system and the spending there, but spending on border security and border control. I only know of one attempt, which is already like a decade ago, by the Overseas Development Initiatives in the UK, a think tank that tried to make an estimate, which I don't know by head, but already back then there was it was millions, billions and billions a year, and actually more on externalization efforts than on in the EU itself. So yes, I don't know. I think it's always a difficult approach to try to make a comparison. Sheltering people isn't cheap, but I think still needs to be done. You have to think of a lot of other costs as well, or even countries have when people are there. So no, yeah, maybe one of the others has another answer, but I think it's hard to answer this.
So then there is another question from Adrian Papagapos. She would love to hear Sally's main points on framing and also any advice on how we can effectively create new frames. So that's the occasion to speak about frames now.
Yes, thank you. So now I can finish my presentation. It's very short. I wanted to say that basically, like, I'm so sympathetic to journalists reporting this. I've been a journalist reporting this, and it's only, you know, as I question more and more, I've realized how problematic a lot of our framing is. Yeah, I think we all need to be questioning ourselves all the time, including on the role that racism is playing regarding the value placed on certain lives. The language that we're using, the word migrants, is very clearly being used to dehumanize people by politicians. And I think we're playing into that by using it as journalists. So migrant is a descriptor, but I don't personally think that it should be used in situations where people will suffice. For example, you know, if you say 200 migrants drowned at sea, it's almost like a way to say those lives don't matter so much as you know, it would have if we said people, or obviously if we said tourists. In that case, I think it's better to say people. Refugees likewise is a legal description, but again, people can be used more often than refugee. The term migration crisis, or particularly European migration crisis, I mean, what we're seeing is a global inequality crisis. Europe spent centuries exploiting Africa, for example, but now we're drawing up our borders and trying to stop people from coming the other way. A large portion of the world has no legal way to travel. That's why they say that they're reduced to this. And often that term European migration crisis, it again totally strips the things that people are fleeing from, you know, wars, dictatorships, persecution, crushing poverty. Crushing poverty itself can be a threat to life, by the way, but you know, often it's painted in these terms of people searching for luxuries instead of searching for healthcare, as many people I know have done. I also think that there are big questions to ask about how is this democratic? Are there if there are deliberate decisions being made not to document the consequences of anti-migration policies, meaning Europeans don't know what we're implicated in, what's been done in our name. Is that democratic? And that's not meant to mention splits between the EU Commission and the Parliament or the actions of this so-called Team Europe. And yeah, how to reframe it? I just think that we all need to be questioning ourselves all the time. I don't have the exact answers. Even me expanding my mind from the terminologies that I used to use or the way that I used to see things has taken time. I mean, and I'm still trying to do that. But yeah, I think all of us, and particularly questioning, are we using the language of European bureaucrats, for example, or of European politicians or of far right people? There are efforts being made to make certain terms like migration management common, but do people realize that migration management, that can mean people being locked up indefinitely in detention centers where they can die of starvation and medical neglect? Like, I don't think that that's kind of a sanitized term for something very horrible that's happening. So yeah, the best thing you can do is just question yourself and find answers to yourself. But it's good that we're having this workshop and talking to each other as well, because the more people discuss these things, I think the better.
Thank you. Another question for Elizabeth and or Mark. To what extent is the EU required to monitor how its funding on migration management to third countries spent? How can you get hold of monitoring evaluation report where they exist? Is it FOIA the best route? So freedom of information request. And same question for the UK, if you have any knowledge of that.
I can try. The short answer is I don't know the EU, the monitoring and budgetary requirements on spending. I can pinpoint to some relevant research on that, on the structural funding issues and reporting issues in the EU. But in short, I don't know exactly the question. For the UK is a bit different, particularly in about migration, about the partnership with Rwanda. There will be a specific budgetary reporting that will go through Parliament as well. But obviously the deal is off the table, so that has never happened. But that's actually a very interesting idea. It could be via the freedom of information request, but it could also, I'm sure, and I'm talking about that very superficially, there are reporting rules that should be that such budgeted should be expended somehow. The thing is, how do you find them? Because EU repositories can look like a maze. So unless you know where to go, maybe Mark has a better understanding on that. Thank you.
Mark?
No, I think on EU level it is difficult. It depends on the instruments that are being used. Some have budgetary reporting to Commission, the Council, the Parliament, and are discussed. For example, like the neighborhood cooperation instrument. There it is, although it is still often difficult to see where money is actually going, because it is, for example, there's funding on a project level going to something, and all the money that the implementer of this project is spending, it's often very difficult to see where it's actually going. So it's still on a quite high level. But I think, especially on the EU level, there's a problem with, with things like the Turkey deal or other deals that are essentially, well, they're not really within the EU budget infrastructure. So that makes accountability and oversight very difficult. And there's also not much reporting on it.
Okay.
Something to dive into, yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for these answers. I don't see any more questions, and we are now nearly running out of time. Oh, maybe. Yes, James wants to make a sort of comment. You are muted.
I can jump in if you like.
Sure.
Okay. Did anyone else have a question or no?
No. I think we're done with the question. And
so Mark, I just wanted to follow up with you because I found it really fascinating to hear about all the different actors that are involved in the sort of military industrial space. And I wonder in just a couple of minutes perhaps, whether you could again, maybe double down on what's coming in terms of the digital future, right? And the surveillance aspect. And I guess, I mean, for me, there's sort of two questions here, which is like how much of the Mediterranean can Frontex and other governments actually see now? I mean, they know what is going on, right? But do they know everything that's going on? And then the other part of surveillance to me, which is very interesting, is the sort of mass fingerprinting and what the implications of that are. Perhaps you could talk a little bit to that and the value of that and what more we can perhaps be doing on that. Thanks.
Yeah, on how much of the Mediterranean is visible. There's a lot of monitoring going on, of course, by national border and coast guards, by Frontex, by border and coast guards in northern African countries. So yeah, the ideal of the EU is to have a constant live picture of what is happening at the borders. There's a whole system for this. Which is led by Frontex. But of course, yeah, people still sometimes manage to get on boats and get in between there. It's always difficult to say. I mean, there are many of stories of boats that have been spotted and people who haven't been rescued. There are stories of people who managed to get through everything. So the ideal of the EU is to see everything. It's not there yet, but there's a lot of there's a lot of surveillance going on, which essentially has this effect that people are often pushed to use more dangerous, more risky routes, are driven into the hands of sometimes criminal smuggling, trafficking networks. So all the surveillance actually it doesn't stop migration, but it makes it more risky for people. On fingerprinting, can you repeat the question, please? It's not my.
That was just a question because I know it had come up recently that money was being spent on this form of documentation of people who are not from the European Union. And I just wondered whether that was, in your view, sort of one of these areas where we should be looking more at what is going on.
Yes, I think definitely. I mean, fingerprints are stored on EU level in several databases. These are large databases. They are increasingly connected and made interoperable, which also means that there is a blurring often between migration and border authorities and law enforcement authorities, which come with its own difficulties also in terms of privacy. So increasingly, non-EU countries are used for this as well. I mean, the EU has funded complete setup of complete data fingerprint databases of people in several African countries, which of course makes it easier for them if they ever arrive at Europe to just identify them and get them deported.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful explanation, and your explanation of why surveillance drives people to make even more dangerous journeys, I think, is really important as well. So we've come to the end of time, and I just want to say thanks to Layla for co-moderating, and a very big thanks to our guests, Elizabeth, Mark, and Sally, and a thank you to TNI and the GSCC team for putting this together. And as I said at the top, this is a pilot workshop. And if you are interested in further workshops that bring together experts working on EU border policies, please do let us know. And I think we're going to put a survey up on the screen very shortly, if not right now. And if you have a moment to fill it in, please do so. You can also email Nick Buxton at TNI at nick@tni.org if you have any suggestions and comments that you want to communicate that way. And we're also going to leave the chat open for a minute or two so you can wrap up any conversations there. But that's it from me. And thank you again for joining us today. Thanks very much. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.